Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. The year was 1862, when a 15-year-old enslaved girl named Celia vanished from the Hargrove plantation before dawn, slipping into the fog-laden cypress swamps that bordered the property. Ezekiel Hargrove, the plantation's owner, dispatched 5 of his most experienced slave catchers into that wilderness to retrieve her. They carried rifles, hounds, and chains. By nightfall, only one man emerged from those woods. He was found wandering the edge of the property, his clothes torn and his eyes vacant with terror. He never spoke again. The other 4 hunters were never seen, and no trace of young Celia was ever recovered. The Hargrove plantation stood in Assumption Parish, Louisiana, a sprawling estate of over 2,000 acres that pressed against the dark waters of the Atchafalaya Basin, the largest river swamp in the United States. The main house, a 2-story structure of whitewashed wood with a broad gallery supported by thick columns, overlooked endless fields of sugarcane that stretched toward the horizon in one direction and dissolved into cypress groves and black water in the other. Ezekiel Hargrove had inherited the land from his father in 1841 and expanded it ruthlessly, purchasing adjoining properties and increasing his enslaved workforce to meet his ambitions. According to parish records discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1978, the Hargrove estate held over 120 enslaved individuals by the autumn of 1862, a number that placed him among the wealthiest planters in the region. These same records revealed a darker truth. The mortality rate among the enslaved population at the Hargrove plantation was nearly 3 times the parish average, with deaths attributed to fever, accident, and exhaustion appearing with grim regularity. Neighboring planters, according to letters preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, referred to Hargrove as effective but excessive, a man whose discipline produced results but left broken bodies in its wake. The girl known in plantation records simply as Celia first appeared in the Hargrove ledgers in the spring of 1859, recorded as a purchase from a failing cotton plantation in Natchez, Mississippi, for the sum of $600. She was 12 years old at the time of sale, described in the bill of sale as healthy, no brands, no scars, suitable for domestic work. A letter from the Hargrove overseer, a man named Tobias Marsh, to his brother in Baton Rouge, dated June of that year, mentions the new arrivals from Mississippi and notes that the young one has been placed in the main house under the direction of Madame Hargrove. For nearly 2 years, Celia worked as a house servant, performing duties that included cleaning, laundering, and attending to Josephine Hargrove's personal needs. Then, in the early months of 1861, she was abruptly reassigned to the sugarcane fields, a demotion that the plantation records do not explain. The overseer's quarterly report from that period notes only the transfer with no elaboration, though the timing coincided with Ezekiel Hargrove's return from an extended business trip to New Orleans. Whatever occurred during those months remains obscured by the silence of the historical record, a gap that would not begin to be filled until much later. What survives from this period is a diary kept by Josephine Hargrove, a fragile volume bound in cracked leather that was discovered in 1962 among family papers donated to the Louisiana State Museum. Her entries are largely concerned with household matters, social visits, and complaints about the humidity, but several passages reference Celia directly. In an entry dated March 1861, Josephine writes that the girl possesses an unusual calmness that I find unsettling, as though she sees through the surfaces of things to something beneath. Another entry, from later that same month, notes with evident disapproval that Celia has taken to disappearing into the swamp edges for hours at a time, claiming to gather herbs for poultices and remedies. She returns with roots and leaves I do not recognize, Josephine observed, and the other servants treat her with a deference I do not understand and do not like. What Celia learned in those swamps, and from whom, would become a matter of dark speculation in the years that followed. The night of October 14th, 1862, was unseasonably warm, with a heavy mist rising from the Atchafalaya basin and settling over the Hargrove plantation like a shroud. The enslaved workers were locked into their quarters at 9 o'clock, as was the standard practice, with the overseer Tobias Marsh conducting a head count before securing the heavy iron padlock on the main door of the women's cabin. His report from that evening, preserved in the Louisiana State Archives, confirms that all individuals were present and accounted for, including Celia, who was noted as occupying her usual pallet near the rear wall. Sometime between midnight and dawn, she vanished. When the quarters were unlocked at first light for the morning labor call, Celia's pallet was empty, her few possessions undisturbed, and no trace of her departure evident. The overseer's subsequent report, filed with Ezekiel Hargrove that same morning, noted that the padlock showed no signs of tampering, the door hinges had not been disturbed, and the single window, a narrow opening covered with wooden slats, remained secured from the inside. None of the other women in the cabin reported hearing Celia rise or move during the night, and none could explain how she had passed through a locked door without detection. The report describes Hargrove's reaction as one of immediate and violent rage, though not, it seems, merely at the loss of property. According to Marsh's account, Hargrove demanded to know if she had taken anything with her, repeating the question with an intensity that the overseer found unusual. When Marsh responded that he was unaware of any missing items, Hargrove reportedly struck him across the face and ordered a search of the main house. What this search revealed, or what object Hargrove believed Celia had stolen, is not recorded in any surviving document. The overseer's report notes only that the search was conducted, and that Hargrove emerged from his study with a countenance I have never before witnessed, pale and trembling with fury. Within the hour, riders were dispatched to summon the men who would pursue Celia into the swamps, and Hargrove offered a sum for her return that, according to Marsh, exceeded her purchase price several times over. The reason for this extraordinary bounty would remain a mystery for more than a century. By dawn on October 15th, 1862, 5 men had gathered on the front gallery of the Hargrove plantation house, summoned by riders sent out in the final hours of darkness. These were not ordinary farmhands or local militia, but professional slave catchers, men who made their livings tracking runaways through the forests and swamps of Louisiana and returning them to their owners for a price. The leader of the group was Silas Crenshaw, a lean and weathered man in his late 40s whose reputation in Assumption Parish was fearsome and well-earned. According to court records from earlier cases, Crenshaw had captured over 60 runaways in his career, and it was said among the enslaved population that he could track a man through water and find a trail where none existed. Alongside him stood the Thibodeau brothers, Marcus and Abel, Cajun trackers from the Bayou country, who knew the Atchafalaya basin as well as any men alive, and who brought with them a pack of 6 hounds trained to follow human scent through the densest terrain. The 4th member of the party was Cornelius Finch, a heavy-set man with a coiled whip at his belt, whose methods of retrieval had earned him a reputation for brutality that made even other slave catchers uneasy. The 5th and youngest was Jerome Boudreau, only 19 years old. the son of a struggling farmer who had joined Crenshaw's operations the previous year to help support his family. Payment records discovered in the Hargrove estate papers, now held by the University of Louisiana archives, reveal the terms Ezekiel Hargrove offered these men for the capture and return of a single 15-year-old girl. The sum was $800, to be divided among the five upon successful retrieval, with an additional $200 promised if the girl was returned unharmed and before nightfall. This total of $1,000 exceeded Celia's original purchase price by nearly $400 and represented an extraordinary expense that no rational planter would incur for the recovery of one field hand. Whatever Celia had, taken from the Hargrove house, or whatever she knew that Hargrove feared she might reveal, had made her retrieval a matter of urgent and irrational necessity. The five men accepted the terms without question, gathered their weapons and supplies, and by mid-morning had entered the swamps with the hounds baying ahead of them. The five hunters entered the Atchafalaya Basin shortly before noon on October 15, 1862, following a narrow trail that led from the northern edge of the Hargrove property into the labyrinth of cypress groves, black water, and tangled undergrowth that comprised the largest river swamp in North America. The hounds moved ahead, their baying echoing through the trees as they picked up a scent trail that led deeper into the wilderness. Silas Crenshaw took the lead, his rifle cradled in his arms, while the Thibodeau brothers flanked the group, and Cornelius Finch and young Jerome Boudreau brought up the rear. They carried provisions for 2 days, though Crenshaw had assured Hargrove they would have the girl before sunset. A letter from Marcus Thibodeau to his wife, Colette, written in the early morning hours before the group departed, and later discovered among family papers in 1934, reveals that at least one member of the party harbored doubts about the undertaking. The letter, penned in the unsteady hand of a man with limited education, expresses unease about the job in terms that seem almost prophetic in hindsight. Crenshaw says the girl knows those swamps better than we do, Marcus wrote. And that troubles me because I have never heard him say such a thing about any runaway. He told us she has been going into the basin since she was 12, learning the paths and the waters, and that we should not expect an easy chase. The letter also notes Hargrove's unusual instructions regarding Celia's condition upon capture. The planter wants her back alive and not harmed, Marcus reported, and he was very particular about this, saying we would forfeit the entire payment if she was damaged in any way. I do not know what this girl has done or what she carries, but I have never seen a man so desperate to recover a single slave. Marcus closed the letter by promising his wife he would return by the following evening, and asked her to kiss their children for him. He signed it with his name and the date, October 15th, 1862. It was the last letter he would ever write. His wife kept it folded in her Bible for the rest of her life, and she never learned what became of him in those swamps. For the first 2 hours after the hunting party entered the Atchafalaya Basin, the sound of the hounds could be heard from the Hargrove plantation and from neighboring properties, their baying carrying across the still autumn air in a rhythm familiar to anyone who had witnessed a slave chase. Then, shortly before noon, the dogs fell silent. This sudden cessation was noted by multiple witnesses whose testimonies were later collected by a parish investigator attempting to reconstruct the events of that day. A farmer named Dupuis, whose property bordered the swamp to the east, stated that the hounds had been in full cry one moment and then simply stopped, as if they had all been struck mute at once. He described an unnatural stillness that settled over the basin in the hours that followed, a silence so complete that he could not hear even the usual sounds of birds or insects. It was as though the swamp itself had drawn a breath and was holding it, Dupuis reportedly told the investigator, and I felt a chill though the day was warm. That same afternoon, Dupuis reported seeing a figure standing motionless at the tree line where his cleared land met the edge of the swamp. He observed the figure for several minutes through the haze, but he could not determine whether it was one of the hunters, a runaway, or someone else entirely. When he called out, the figure withdrew into the trees and did not reappear. By dusk, Ezekiel Hargrove's unease had grown into alarm. The hunting party had been expected to return by mid-afternoon at the latest, and the continued silence from the swamp was unprecedented in Crenshaw's long career. Hargrove dispatched a rider, a young enslaved man named Solomon, to the edge of the basin with instructions to signal with a gunshot and wait for a response. Solomon rode to the tree line, fired 3 times into the air, and waited as the echoes faded into the cypress groves. No response came. He reported that the swamp was quieter than he had ever experienced, without the usual chorus of frogs and nightbirds that accompanied the coming darkness. He saw no sign of the hunters, heard no hounds, and detected no movement among the trees. He returned to the plantation alone, and Hargrove did not sleep that night. At nightfall on October 15th, 1862, a group of field hands returning from the sugarcane rows discovered a figure stumbling along the dirt path that led from the swamp's edge toward the slave quarters. It was Jerome Boudreau, the youngest of the 5 hunters, and he was alone. His clothes hung from his body in shreds, torn by thorns or branches or something else entirely, and his rifle was gone, along with his powder horn and ammunition pouch. His boots were caked with black mud up to the knees, and his hands were bleeding from dozens of small wounds. But it was his face that the field hands would later describe to the parish investigator with a uniformity that suggests the image had been seared into their memories. His eyes were wide and unblinking, staring at something that was not present, and his mouth hung open as though frozen in the middle of a scream that would not come. He did not respond when they spoke to him, did not acknowledge their presence, and when they took his arms to guide him toward the main house, he moved with a mechanical stiffness that one witness compared to a puppet being walked on strings. Ezekiel Hargrove was summoned immediately, and he attempted to question the young man about the fate of the others. But Jerome neither spoke nor gave any indication that he understood the words being addressed to him. A physician from the nearby town of Napoleonville was brought to the plantation the following morning, and his report, preserved in parish medical records, describes Jerome's condition in clinical terms that nonetheless convey the strangeness of what he observed. The patient presents with no significant physical injuries that would account for his current state of mental absence, the physician wrote. He is unresponsive to verbal commands, does not track movement with his eyes, and has not spoken since his recovery. The only notable wounds are a series of repetitive scratches and abrasions on both palms, consistent with the patient having clawed repeatedly at rough bark or wood. The physician concluded that Jerome had suffered a severe shock to his mental faculties, and recommended he be kept under observation. He offered no explanation for what could have produced such a profound collapse in a healthy young man of 19, and Jerome himself would never provide one. In the days that followed Jerome Boudreau's return, Ezekiel Hargrove organized multiple search parties to enter the Atchafalaya Basin and locate the 4 missing hunters. He enlisted neighboring planters, hired additional trackers from as far as New Orleans, and offered substantial rewards for any information regarding the fate of Silas Crenshaw, the Thibodeau brothers, and Cornelius Finch. These efforts produced almost nothing. The search parties that ventured into the swamp returned with only fragments objects that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. On the second day, a group led by a tracker from Assumption Parish discovered Marcus Thibodeau's rifle half submerged in a pool of black water, approximately 2 miles from the point where the original hunting party had entered the basin. The weapon was loaded and had not been fired, and there was no sign of its owner or any indication of struggle in the surrounding area. The following day, another party found a single boot belonging to Cornelius Finch wedged between the roots of a cypress tree, the leather torn as though it had been ripped from his foot by force. Of the other men and their equipment, no trace was ever recovered. The search parties also reported a phenomenon that would be repeated in the accounts of all who entered the basin during that week. The hounds brought to track the missing men refused to proceed beyond a certain point deep in the swamp, a point that different groups described as roughly the same location. The dogs would whimper, flatten their ears, and retreat despite the commands and even the whips of their handlers. No tracker or hunter among the searchers could explain this behavior, and it contributed to a growing reluctance among the men to continue the effort. According to a letter from a neighboring planter named Thibault to his cousin in Baton Rouge, the search was ultimately abandoned after one party reported hearing singing emanating from somewhere deep in the swamp, a woman's voice carrying through the trees in a melody none of them recognized. The men could not determine the direction of the sound, which seemed to come from all around them at once, and they withdrew in haste. After 5 days, Hargrove called off the search, and the 4 hunters were never seen again. Jerome Boudreau never spoke another word for the remaining years of his life. In the weeks following his emergence from the swamp, his family attempted every remedy available to them, consulting physicians, priests, and folk healers from across the parish, but nothing could penetrate the wall of silence that had descended upon the young man. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, his hands occasionally moving in repetitive motions as though grasping at something invisible, and he showed no recognition of his parents, his siblings, or the home where he had spent his entire life. By December of 1862, his family made the difficult decision to commit him to the Louisiana State Insane Asylum in New Orleans, where he would spend the next 9 years until his death in 1871 at the age of 28. The cause of death was recorded as general decline, a vague classification that revealed nothing about what had truly consumed him. For decades, Jerome Boudreau remained a footnote in the story of the Hargrove disappearances, a witness who could offer no testimony until 1953, when a researcher studying the history of mental health treatment in Louisiana discovered a cache of patient records from the New Orleans asylum that had been scheduled for destruction. Among these documents was Jerome's file, which contained not only the expected medical observations and treatment notes, but also a collection of drawings that the staff had preserved due to their unusual nature. According to the attending physician's notes, Jerome spent much of his time in the asylum producing the same image over and over again, using whatever materials were available to him, including pencils, charcoal, and even his own blood when other implements were taken away. The drawings all depicted the same scene, with only minor variations: a circle of cypress trees surrounding a low mound of earth, with 5 figures kneeling around the mound and a 6th figure standing above them. The kneeling figures were drawn with their heads bowed and their hands bound behind their backs, while the standing figure, smaller than the others and appearing to be female, had arms raised toward the sky. The physician noted that Jerome would become agitated if prevented from completing these drawings, and that he produced hundreds of them during his confinement. What this image represented, and what Jerome had witnessed in the swamp that day, he took with him to his grave. In the weeks following the disappearance of the 4 hunters and the abandonment of the search, Ezekiel Hargrove underwent a transformation that those who knew him found as disturbing as the events that had precipitated it. The man who had once commanded his plantation with iron authority and brutal efficiency became erratic, withdrawn, and consumed by a private terror that he would not name. His wife Josephine's diary entries from this period, preserved in the same collection that documented her earlier observations of Celia, paint a portrait of a man unraveling. He paces the halls at night and will not tell me what he fears, she wrote in late October. He mutters to himself when he believes no one is listening, always the same words. It should never have been taken. It must be returned. When I ask him what he means, he looks at me as though I am a stranger and says nothing. Hargrove's behavior extended beyond private anxiety into actions that damaged his own financial interests. Parish records show that between October and December of 1862, he sold nearly 40 enslaved people to neighboring plantations, often at prices well below market value, as though he were desperate to reduce the population of his estate, regardless of the cost. He also refused to enter the northern wing of the plantation house, the side that faced the Atchafalaya Basin, and ordered that the windows in those rooms be boarded over. Servants reported that he would stand on the southern gallery for hours, staring away from the swamp, and that he kept a loaded pistol with him at all times, even at meals. On the morning of December 3rd, 1862, Ezekiel Hargrove was found dead on the road between his plantation and the neighboring Thibault property. The official cause of death was recorded as injuries sustained from a fall from his horse, and indeed, his horse was discovered nearby, apparently thrown into a panic by something unknown. However, the physician who examined the body noted in a private letter to a colleague that the injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall, suggesting instead that Hargrove had been dragged some distance by the stirrup. What had frightened the horse, and whether Hargrove's death was truly an accident, was never determined. He was buried in the family cemetery 3 days later, and Josephine Hargrove sold the plantation within the year and never returned to Louisiana. For nearly 4 decades after the events of October 1862, the story of Celia and the vanished hunters persisted only in local memory, passed down in whispered conversations among the people of Assumption Parish, but never committed to any official record. Then, in 1901, an interviewer working for the Federal Writers Project arrived in southern Louisiana to collect testimonies from formerly enslaved people as part of a national effort to document the realities of slavery before that generation passed away entirely. Among those interviewed was an elderly woman named Matilda, who had been enslaved at the Hargrove plantation as a child and who was present during the autumn of 1862. Matilda's testimony, transcribed by the interviewer and preserved in the Library of Congress archives, provides the first account of what may have driven Celia to flee and what Ezekiel Hargrove so desperately wanted to conceal. According to Matilda, who was 11 years old at the time of Celia's disappearance, Celia had been summoned repeatedly to the main house during the year following her arrival, visits that the other enslaved people understood but did not speak of openly. By the spring of 1861, it was evident that Celia was carrying a child, and she was quietly removed from house duties and sent to the fields to work until her confinement. The baby, a girl, was born in October of 1861, and Matilda recalled that Celia was permitted to keep the child with her for only a few weeks before it was taken away. The official explanation, repeated by the overseer, was that the infant had been sold to a trader passing through the parish, but Matilda told the interviewer that this was not what the enslaved community believed. "The child was never sold," Matilda stated, her voice dropping to a whisper that the transcriber noted in the margin of the document. "She died, though no one would say how, and she was buried somewhere on the property, though no one would say where. Matilda added that Celia had changed after the child was taken, becoming silent and watchful, and that she spent even more time at the edges of the swamp, sometimes not returning until after dark. When asked if she knew what Celia had taken with her on the night of her escape, Matilda would say only that a mother does not leave her child behind, not even a dead one, and then she refused to speak. For over a century, the land that had once comprised the Hargrove plantation changed hands multiple times, the fields reverting to wilderness in some areas, and being cleared for new development in others. The main house burned under unexplained circumstances in 1917, and by the late 20th century, little physical evidence remained of the estate that had once dominated that corner of Assumption Parish. In 1987, however, an archaeological team from Louisiana State University, conducting a survey of antebellum plantation sites in the region, made a discovery that would cast the events of 1862 in an entirely new and more disturbing light. While mapping the foundations of former outbuildings on the property, the team identified the remains of a root cellar that had collapsed sometime in the previous century. Its wooden supports rotted away, and its contents buried beneath decades of accumulated soil and debris. Excavation of this cellar revealed a burial site that had been deliberately concealed. The remains of 5 individuals were recovered from the pit beneath the collapsed structure, and forensic analysis conducted at the university determined that one set of remains belonged to an infant, while the other 4 belonged to adult males. The infant's bones, fragile and incomplete, showed no signs of trauma, and the cause of death could not be determined from the skeletal evidence alone. The remains of the 4 men, however, told a different story. Each of the adult skeletons displayed evidence of perimortem injuries, including blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with heavy blows from a wooden or stone implement. Additionally, the wrist bones of all 4 men showed distinctive grooves and abrasions, indicating that their hands had been bound tightly, likely with rope or wire, at or near the time of death. Among the bones, the archaeological team recovered a rusted set of iron shackles of the type commonly used to restrain enslaved people during the antebellum period, along with scattered buttons and boot nails consistent with mid-19th century manufacture. The forensic report concluded that the 4 men had been killed elsewhere and their bodies transported to the root cellar for concealment, while the infant appeared to have been buried at a different time, possibly earlier. No identification of the remains was possible through physical evidence alone, but the location of the burial site on the former Hargrove property, combined with the historical record of 4 hunters who vanished in October 1862, led researchers to a conclusion that raised more questions than it answered. The archaeological discovery of 1987 established that something terrible had occurred on the Hargrove property, but the full nature of that horror would not be revealed until 2003, when a historian specializing in antebellum Louisiana attended an estate sale in Baton Rouge. The sale consisted of items from the collection of a recently deceased woman who had been a distant descendant of the Hargrove family, and among the furniture, silverware, and faded portraits was a small iron box with a rusted lock that the auctioneer had been unable to open. The historian purchased the box for a modest sum, and upon forcing the lock, discovered inside a leather-bound ledger filled with entries in a cramped, angular hand that archival comparison later confirmed to be that of Ezekiel Hargrove himself. The ledger was not a financial record of the plantation's operations, but something far more private and damning. It contained a list of enslaved women, identified only by first names, who had borne children fathered by Hargrove between 1843 and 1862, along with annotations recording what had become of each child. Some entries noted that infants had been sold, others that they had died of illness, but several contained a more chilling notation that appeared repeatedly throughout the document. Disposed of. The entry for Celia confirmed what Matilda's testimony had suggested and what the archaeological evidence had implied. It recorded the birth of a female child in October 1861, followed by a single annotation dated 3 months later, in January 1862. Disposed of, root cellar. The ledger offered no explanation for this disposal, no indication of how the infant had died, or why Hargrove had chosen to conceal her remains, rather than simply recording a death from natural causes. The final entry concerning Celia, dated October 14th, 1862, the night of her disappearance, contained only 2 words written in a hand that appeared more agitated than the earlier notations, the letters pressed deep into the page. She knows. What Celia knew, and what she had taken from the Hargrove property on the night she vanished, now seemed clear. She had somehow discovered the location of her daughter's burial, and she had gone to reclaim the child's remains before fleeing into the swamp. What happened next, and how 4 armed hunters met their deaths at the hands of a 15-year-old girl, remained a question that the ledger couldn't answer. In the years following the archaeological discovery and the revelation of the hidden ledger, researchers from several universities undertook a comprehensive effort to compile oral histories from the descendants of people who had been enslaved in Assumption Parish during the antebellum period. These interviews, conducted between 2005 and 2012, revealed a rich tradition of stories and legends that had been passed down through generations, many of which had never been recorded in any official document. Among the most persistent of these oral traditions were accounts of a place deep in the Atchafalaya Basin, known as the Reckoning Ground, described consistently across multiple interviews as a circle of ancient cypress trees surrounding a low mound of earth in a part of the swamp that few people could find and fewer still would willingly enter. According to these accounts, the Reckoning Ground was a place of judgment, a site where those who had committed unspeakable acts against the innocent would be called to answer for their crimes, not before any human court, but before the swamp itself. The stories varied in their details but agreed on certain essential points. They spoke of a girl, always described as young and slight, who had led a group of wicked men into the swamp under the pretense of flight, guiding them deeper and deeper into the basin until they reached the circle of trees. There, according to the legend, the men were made to kneel and face judgment for their sins, and the swamp delivered a justice that no earthly authority would have rendered. The accounts differed on whether this justice was enacted by the girl herself, by spirits she had summoned, or by the land and water acting in accordance with some older law. But they agreed on the outcome. The men never returned, and the girl was never seen again, having become part of the swamp's own mythology. One phrase appeared in nearly every interview, repeated with the weight of ancestral warning. No one who enters the Reckoning Ground with blood on their hands ever returns. Whether this place truly exists, and whether the events described in these oral histories bear any relationship to what actually occurred in October 1862, cannot be verified by any evidence currently available. Yet the consistency of these accounts across families with no known connection to one another suggests that something happened in that swamp, something that the descendants of those who witnessed its aftermath felt compelled to remember and to pass on. Celia was never found. Despite the efforts of researchers, genealogists, and historians over the past century and a half, no record of her appears in any archive in Louisiana or the neighboring states after October 1862. She does not surface in freedmen's records after the Civil War, in census documents, in church registries, or in any of the other fragmentary sources that sometimes allow us to trace the lives of formerly enslaved people who escaped to the north or to Canada. It is as though she stepped into the Atchafalaya Basin on that fog-shrouded morning and ceased to exist in the world of written records entirely. Some historians who have studied the case theorize that she died in the swamp, succumbing to exposure, injury, or the countless dangers that the basin presented to anyone attempting to traverse it alone. Others suggest that she successfully escaped north, perhaps assuming a new identity and living out her days in freedom without ever revealing the truth of what had happened in Louisiana. But the most unsettling theory, and the one that the evidence most strongly supports, is that Celia exacted vengeance for her murdered child upon the men who had been sent to capture her, that she led them to a place deep in the swamp where she or something else rendered a judgment upon them, and that she then vanished into the wilderness, taking her secrets with her into oblivion. The drawings that Jerome Boudreau compulsively produced until his death, depicting 5 kneeling figures before a 6th, the bound skeletons discovered in the root cellar with their shattered skulls, the oral traditions of the reckoning ground passed down through generations of descendants. These remain the only testimony to what truly happened in those swamps in October 1862, and they pose more questions than they answer. The Hargrove Plantation House burned to its foundations in 1917, the cause of the fire never determined, and today the land has returned to cypress and black water, the fields reclaimed by the wilderness that Ezekiel Hargrove once sought to dominate. Locals in Assumption Parish say that on autumn nights, when the fog rises from the basin and the air grows still, singing can still be heard drifting from somewhere deep in the swamp, a woman's voice carrying a melody that no one recognizes. But no one ventures close enough to be certain, and perhaps that is as it should be. Some places keep their secrets, and some stories refuse to end.